The night had fallen quiet over the small frontier town, the kind of silence that carried the weight of 100 unspoken stories. A lantern swung gently outside the saloon, throwing a thin streak of light across the dusty main street where old wagons rested like bones of a forgotten time. The air smelled of pinewood smoke and worn leather, and the wind carried a dry whisper from the desert beyond. People here lived close to the edge of things, the edge of the wild lands, the edge of law, and sometimes the edge of their own fears. And tonight, all those edges met at the town square where a strange kind of lottery had just ended. It was not the kind of lottery a man bought tickets for with hope or laughter. It was one born out of desperation, settlers short on men to guard their lands, and tribal families trying to keep peace after years of blood and fire. No one could tell who started the idea, but by sunset, a crowd had gathered, and by moonrise, the name of a trembling young woman had been drawn. The prize, or the sentence depending on who you asked, was marriage. Her husband, chosen not by love or choice but by chance, was an Apache warrior who had stood silent at the edge of the crowd, his arms folded, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his weathered hat. She stood there now, the bride everyone whispered about. Her pale hands clutched a worn shawl against her chest, and her heartbeat seemed loud enough for the whole town to hear. The preacher's voice had faded, the townsfolk had drifted away, and now it was only her and the man who was now her husband. He didn't move for a long time. The firelight caught the faint glimmer of the beads around his neck, the lines of his face carved deep by wind and war. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and calm, the kind that carried more truth than threat. "I don't want to scare you," he whispered, his tone almost tender, as if the words were meant for a child frightened by thunder. But the truth was, she was scared. Not because he looked wild or dangerous, but because there was something in his quiet that unsettled her. He didn't look like the men she knew, the farmers, the ranch hands, or the merchants who spoke too much and drank too often. This man carried silence like armor. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't ask for her hand. Fate, or cruelty, had given it to him. Around them, the night deepened. The moon rose high, turning the roofs of the town silver and the world around them strangely still. He turned away from her, tightening the straps on his horse. "You can stay here if you wish," he said, not looking back. "But come morning, folks will talk. If you ride with me, they'll talk too. So decide which talk you'd rather hear." His words weren't a command. They were a truth, one she couldn't escape. She swallowed hard, her breath trembling in her throat. Behind her, the small wooden chapel stood empty, its doors still open from the hurried ceremony. The sound of the wind pressing through the doorway made the building moan like a restless spirit. She had no family here, no place to run to. The town had already given her away like a prize mule, and in their eyes, she now belonged to the man before her. She took a step forward, then another, her boots sinking slightly into the dust. The Apache warrior didn't move until she was close enough for him to sense her hesitation. When he turned, his dark eyes met hers with something that wasn't pity, nor pride, just understanding. "You're cold," he said simply, handing her his worn blanket. It smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. She took it, clutching it close, unsure if the warmth she felt came from the cloth or the strange calm in his voice. The road out of town stretched far and lonely. The townsfolk watched from their windows as the two figures, one on horseback, one walking beside, disappeared into the moonlight. Some shook their heads, others whispered about sin, fate, and foolish bargains made to keep peace between two worlds. But no one stopped them. No one ever did when things like this happened. By the time dawn crept over the desert, they had reached a small canyon where his people once camped. The fire from last night's embers still smoked faintly, and the cry of a hawk echoed across the cliffs. She sat on a rock, her eyes heavy from exhaustion and confusion. He prepared a small fire, his movements quiet and efficient. "You think I wanted this?" he asked finally, his tone carrying neither anger nor regret. She didn't answer. "My people are hungry," he continued softly. "They said a union might bring trade, food, safety. I said no, but the chief pulled my name when yours was called. So here we are." There was a strange honesty in his words. It didn't comfort her, but it made her heart ache in a way she didn't expect. For the first time she realized he was not her captor, but just another soul caught in the trap of men's promises and politics. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, feeding small sticks to the flame. "I've seen enough fear to last a lifetime." She watched him as the firelight flickered across his face, the scars, the calm, the unspoken weariness. He was not the savage the town painted him to be. He was a man shaped by loss, by hunger, by years of seeing his world shrink. She didn't know if she pitied him or respected him, maybe both. When he finally looked up at her again, there was a quiet challenge in his gaze. "You can go back if you wish," he said. "No one will stop you, but if you stay, you'll need to learn to live different. My world isn't like yours." His voice softened on the last words, almost as if he hoped she'd understand something beyond them. Her lips trembled. "And what if I don't fit in your world?" she asked. He smiled faintly, the first trace of warmth crossing his face. "Neither do I anymore." The wind picked up then, carrying a swirl of dust between them, like the ghost of all the words they hadn't said. The sun began to rise, painting the canyon in shades of gold and red. Somewhere in that moment she felt the faintest shift, not of safety, but of possibility. The kind that begins in fear and grows into something neither can name yet. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. She hesitated, then took it, feeling the strength in his palm. It wasn't the touch of ownership, but of understanding, of two people thrown together by fate, trying to find ground in a land that belonged to neither of them anymore. As they walked toward the ridge, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Riders. Dust rose along the horizon, moving fast. His eyes narrowed. "They're not mine," he said sharply, scanning the trail. "Stay behind me." Her heart raced. "Who are they?" He didn't answer. His hand went to the knife at his side, his muscles tightening like a bowstring. The look on his face told her enough. Danger was coming. And this fragile thread of peace they'd found might be torn apart before it even began. The rising sun caught the glint of rifles in the distance, and the desert, once so still, now seemed alive with the promise of violence. She clutched the blanket tighter, the fire crackling low behind them. The man she'd feared only hours ago now stood as her only shield between life and death. He turned slightly, his voice steady and low. "Whatever happens," he said, "remember, you chose to stay." And in that breath before chaos broke the dawn, the trembling bride understood something deeper than fear, that in this unforgiving land, survival wasn't given. It was earned, and sometimes it began with a whisper. The dust from the riders grew thicker in the morning light, curling like smoke over the canyon rim. The Apache warrior's eyes narrowed as he watched their silhouettes. The woman could sense the change in his breathing, steady, controlled, but with a tension that made her pulse quicken. The horses below were moving fast, their hooves drumming against the hard earth. Whoever they were, they weren't travelers. The way they moved, the formation, the purpose in their charge, it meant trouble. He motioned her to crouch behind a rock. She obeyed without a word, her heart pounding. He knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his knife. "Stay quiet," he murmured. His voice, though calm, carried an edge that silenced every question in her throat. She pressed her shawl tighter around her shoulders, peering through a gap in the rocks. The riders slowed near the base of the ridge. There were 5 of them, rough men in dust-covered coats, their faces half hidden under wide hats. She could make out rifles slung across their backs and the heavy smell of whiskey even from a distance. The leader, a man with a red scarf around his neck, raised a hand to stop the others. "Tracks go up that way," he said in a voice loud enough to carry through the still air. "Looks like they took the canyon road. He's got the girl with him." Her breath caught. "They were looking for them." She turned toward the Apache warrior, fear flickering in her eyes. But he didn't move, didn't blink. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Men who think they own the land," he said quietly, "and everything that walks on it." She looked back at the riders who had begun to dismount, scanning the ground. The warrior's hand moved slowly to his rifle, his movements smooth and deliberate. "You can't fight them all," she said under her breath. He glanced at her briefly, and there was a faint spark of something like a smile. Not of arrogance, but of someone who had heard that line too many times before. "I don't need to fight them all," he said softly. "Just the one who leads." Before she could answer, a gunshot cracked through the morning. The bullet struck the rock above their heads, showering them with grit. "There!" one of the men shouted. The Apache warrior pulled her down and rolled behind a larger boulder. The air filled with echoes. Gunfire, shouts, the thud of boots. The canyon that had been so silent moments ago was alive with violence. Then as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. Dust hung in the air and the sound of boots drew closer. The leader's voice called out again, slower this time, almost mocking. "You can't hide forever, Redskin. The girl belongs to us. Town law says so. The warrior's jaw tightened. Town law, he muttered. Their law. He looked toward the woman, his eyes steady. Stay here. Before she could protest, he was gone, silent as a shadow, slipping between the rocks. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying not to cry out. From where she crouched, she could hear movement. The scuffle of boots, a sharp grunt, then silence. Moments later, the red scarf leader stumbled into view, clutching his arm. His rifle clattered to the ground. Behind him, the Apache appeared, his face unreadable, his blade glinting in the sunlight. The men hesitated. None dared step forward. The leader's voice broke the silence. You'll regret this, he spat, backing away. You think marrying some white girl makes you a man of the law? You're still a savage, and she's nothing but stolen property. The warrior's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. He let the man retreat, his blade lowering only when the riders mounted their horses and disappeared down the canyon road. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind a heavy stillness. The woman rose slowly, her legs shaking. You could have killed them, she said quietly. I could have, he replied. But then they'd send 20 more. He knelt, wiping the dust from his hands. Fear keeps men quiet longer than death. The words hung in the air. She looked at him, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified. He had protected her, but at what cost? The law in town was not kind to men like him, and now, by standing beside him, she was part of that defiance. As they packed their few belongings, she couldn't help but ask, Why didn't you let them take me back? It would have been easier. He tightened the strap on his horse and paused. Easier isn't always right, he said. Besides, you're my wife now, even if the world says otherwise. His words stirred something complicated inside her, a mix of fear, duty, and an unexpected flicker of trust. She didn't love him, didn't even know him, yet she couldn't deny the strange safety his presence brought. They rode until noon, the heat rising off the rocks in shimmering waves. The canyon opened into a valley dotted with scrub and cottonwood trees. In the distance, smoke rose from a small settlement, not the town they'd left behind, but a camp tucked beside a stream. He slowed his horse. My people stay there, he said quietly. If you're going to survive here, you'll need to learn their ways. Her stomach tightened. The thought of living among his tribe, strangers who might not welcome her, filled her with dread. Will they accept me? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Some will, he said finally. Some won't, but they'll see that I stand by you. That's all that matters for now. The camp came into view. A few canvas shelters, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing near the water. When the riders at the edge of camp saw them, the laughter faded. All eyes turned to the white woman beside the Apache warrior. Whispers rippled through the group, sharp and cold. An older woman stepped forward, her hair braided with feathers, her eyes sharp as flint. You bring trouble, she said in their language. The warrior answered in a low voice, too quiet for his new wife to understand. The woman's gaze shifted toward her, lingering on her pale skin, her trembling hands. Finally, the elder turned and walked away, motioning them to follow. They reached a small hut built of timber and hide. You stay here, he said gently. I'll speak with the chief. She nodded, stepping inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of sage. There was a woven mat, a clay jar of water, and a blanket folded neatly in the corner. It was simple, but it felt like more than she deserved. She sat for a long time, listening to the distant murmurs outside. Every now and then, she caught fragments of their language, tones of distrust, of questioning. She thought of the town she left behind, the faces that turned away as she was led out under the moon. She had been alone then. She was alone now too, but somehow it felt different. There was purpose in this silence. When he returned, his face was unreadable. They will let you stay, he said finally. But not as my wife. Not yet, she frowned. What do you mean? The chief believes the marriage wasn't made by choice. He says it dishonors both sides. Until you choose it yourself, you live as a guest, not as my woman. His words struck her harder than she expected. A strange mix of relief and disappointment twisted in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but he turned away. Rest now, he said. We'll talk when the sun goes down. That night she couldn't sleep. The sounds of drums echoed softly from the campfire and shadows danced against the walls. Through the small opening in the hide, she could see the warrior sitting alone by the riverbank, his face lit by the moon. He looked lost in thought, like a man haunted by ghosts only he could see. She watched him for a long time, wondering what kind of life had shaped him, what memories lay behind those quiet eyes. Perhaps he had loved once. Perhaps he had buried more than one dream in the dry soil of this land. As the night deepened, a coyote cried in the distance. The sound carried through the valley like a warning. She turned her gaze to the horizon and froze. Far beyond the campfires, faint lights moved across the plain. Lanterns, riders coming fast. Her heart sank. The peace they had found was already slipping away. The past, it seemed, was not done chasing them yet. The faint glow of lanterns on the far horizon grew brighter as the night deepened, moving in a slow, deliberate line across the valley. The woman stood frozen near the doorway of the small hut, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't need to be told what those lights meant. The riders had returned. The same men from the canyon, or perhaps others sent by the town to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Behind her, the quiet hum of the camp began to shift. Voices murmured in low tones. Children were hurried into shelters, and warriors moved toward their weapons with practiced silence. The Apache warrior was the last to move. He had been sitting by the river, but the moment the sound of horses reached his ears, he stood and turned toward the lights. His eyes caught the flicker of flame in the distance. Too many torches for a small party. He walked back toward the camp, his expression calm but sharp with thought. When he reached her, she could see the question already burning in his gaze. "You saw them?" he asked. She nodded. "They're coming fast." He didn't look surprised. "They won't come to talk." He glanced toward the chief's lodge, where the older man now stood at the entrance, watching the valley with grim understanding. "They'll want to make an example. They think I stole you. They'll try to take you back." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "If I go back, will they leave you alone?" He turned his gaze on her, steady and unflinching. "No, they'll hang me before dawn." The words were matter-of-fact, as if he'd already accepted the cost. He moved closer to her, lowering his voice. "If this turns bad, run toward the cliffs. Follow the water until it disappears into the canyon. Don't stop." She wanted to protest, to say she wouldn't leave him, but before she could, the first rifle crack split the night. A bullet struck one of the cooking pots near the fire, sending sparks flying. The camp exploded into movement. Women pulled children inside tents, and warriors rushed to the outer edge, forming a line. The Apache warrior grabbed his rifle and crouched low. "They're testing our ground," he said, "trying to see if we'll scatter." The chief raised his staff, shouting words in their language. Within moments, 2 young riders were sent down the trail to scout the size of the enemy. The woman could barely breathe as the sounds of hoofbeats echoed across the plains. She pressed her back against the wooden frame of the hut, watching the warrior's calm face through the flickering firelight. Minutes passed like hours. Then from the darkness came the scouts' cries. "Many riders. 20, maybe more." The chief's face hardened. "They bring soldiers," he said in English, his accent thick but clear. "Not just men from town." The woman felt her stomach twist. Soldiers meant law, and law meant she had no voice. She was property in their eyes, a pawn in a broken treaty between 2 worlds. Her life had been reduced to a claim written in ink and blood. The Apache warrior turned toward the chief. "We can't hold the valley," he said. "They'll burn it to the ground. We need to move through the canyon." The chief hesitated. "And abandon our camp?" "They'll destroy it either way," the warrior said. "At least the people will live." The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Go, take the woman. You know the trails." Before she could speak, the warrior took her hand and led her toward the rear path that wound behind the camp. The moon had risen high, painting the desert in pale silver. Behind them, the glow of the fires grew brighter as the raiders advanced. She could hear the clash of metal and the cries of men carried on the wind. They ran through the brush, the sound of their breaths harsh in the stillness. The ground sloped downward, and the roar of rushing water grew louder. The canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, steep, rugged, and dark. He stopped at the edge, turning to her. "This way," he said. "We'll lose them in the narrow pass." She stumbled after him, her skirts torn, her hands scraped by the rocks. Behind them, gunfire echoed again and flames began to rise from the camp. She looked back once, a streak of orange against the black sky. The home she had barely begun to know was already gone. By dawn, they had made it deep into the canyon. The sound of pursuit had faded, replaced by the slow drip of water and the cry of distant hawks. The warrior moved ahead, silent and alert. She followed close, her legs trembling from exhaustion. When they finally stopped, he motioned for her to sit near a shaded wall of stone. He poured water into her hands from a small flask. "Drink slowly," he said. She obeyed, her mind spinning. They burned everything, she whispered. Your people, they'll rebuild, he said quietly. They've done it before. He sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky was turning gold. But this time they won't forget who started it. She studied his face, the calm lines that hid a storm beneath. Why don't you fight back? She asked. You could have killed them all last night. You had the chance. His eyes shifted toward her. Fighting is easy, he said. Living after is harder. He leaned back against the rock, closing his eyes for a moment. Every fight leaves ghosts. My people already have too many. The silence that followed was heavy. She wanted to understand him, but his words came from a world she had never known. To her, the frontier had always been a place of survival. But for him, it was a graveyard of promises, treaties broken, land stolen, families scattered. As the morning wore on, they followed the river deeper into the canyon. The path narrowed, forcing them to move single file. The cliffs loomed high above, their faces marked with ancient carvings. He ran his fingers across one as they passed. My father made these, he said softly. Before the soldiers took him, what happened to him? She asked gently. They said he resisted. They called it justice. His tone was calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. After that, I stopped believing in their kind of law. She didn't know what to say. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the faint smell of smoke even now. Somewhere far behind them, the ashes of the camp still smoldered. She thought of the people she had left behind. The children, the old woman with the sharp eyes, the chief's steady voice. The guilt pressed heavy on her heart. By midday, they found a small cave near the riverbank. He motioned for her to rest while he went to gather food. She watched him disappear into the trees, his movement silent as the shadows. Alone for the first time since the attack, she finally let her tears fall. Not for herself, but for everything that had been lost. The fragile peace, the hope of belonging, the lives torn apart by greed and fear. When he returned, he carried a small bundle of roots and berries along with a rabbit he had caught. He set them down beside the fire pit. We'll stay here for now, he said, until I know which way they've gone. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Do you think they'll keep looking for us? They'll look, he said. But men like that don't chase long. They only destroy what's in front of them. He looked toward the mouth of the cave, his expression unreadable. Still, we need to be ready. If they find this trail, we won't have much time. The firelight flickered across their faces as the day faded. He sat sharpening his knife while she tended the small flame. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It carried something deeper, something unspoken. She had begun to see him not as a stranger, but as a man shaped by a world that refused to see him as human. Outside, the wind shifted. A faint echo carried through the canyon, the distant call of a horn. The warrior froze, lifting his head. His eyes met hers, sharp with alarm. They're not done, he said. They've found the river trail. He stood quickly, kicking sand over the fire. We move now. She grabbed her things without question. The world outside had turned cold and blue with twilight. As they hurried through the narrow pass, she could hear the faint clatter of hooves behind them again. This time, there was no camp to run to, no tribe waiting to help. Only the canyon, the fading light, and two lives running from a fate neither had chosen. The echo of pursuit grew louder, closer, and for the first time, she realized that the man she once feared might be the only person who could save her from the world that claimed to protect her. The river roared ahead, vanishing into the darkness below. He turned to her, his face tense, his hand reaching out. Trust me, thought he said. It's the only way. And as the thunder of hooves filled the air behind them, she took his hand, stepping with him into the unknown. The canyon walls narrowed until they were no wider than two wagons side by side. The sound of hooves behind them echoing like thunder through the stone corridors. The Apache warrior gripped her hand as they ran, guiding her through the shadows, his breath steady despite the chase. The river beside them had turned wild, its current flashing white under the faint light of the moon. Every few seconds, the distant cries of the riders grew sharper, the kind of sound that meant they were closing in. The air felt heavy with dust and fear. She stumbled on the uneven ground, catching herself against a rock, but he didn't slow. Keep moving, he said, his voice rough from running. They'll reach the bend soon. The way he spoke, calm even in danger, made her trust him more than her own trembling legs. Behind them, a rifle cracked, and the sound of the bullet striking the canyon wall sent a sharp echo across the cliffs. She ducked instinctively, her pulse racing. We can't outrun horses, she gasped. He didn't answer at first. Then he pointed toward a dark slit in the rock ahead, a narrow crevice hidden by shadow and brush. "We don't need to," he said. "We hide." They slipped through the gap, squeezing between the cold stones until they reached a hollow space barely wide enough for two people to crouch. The air was damp, and the smell of earth filled her nose. He pressed a hand over her mouth gently, signaling for silence. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, then closer, until she could hear the riders shouting. Their voices bounced off the canyon walls. "Fan out! Check every crack!" one of them yelled. "That red devil can't have gone far." She pressed her back against the rock, trembling. The warrior's body was close, his breath steady beside her ear. Through the narrow slit she saw shadows passing, the silhouettes of men on horseback, rifles gleaming under the pale sky. One of them stopped right in front of their hiding place. She held her breath until her chest ached. The man spat on the ground, muttered something about half-breeds, and rode on. When the sound of hooves finally faded, she exhaled shakily. The Apache warrior waited another long moment before speaking. "They'll circle around," he said. "They always do. We can't stay here." He moved first, crawling through the narrow gap back into the open canyon. She followed, her limbs aching, her throat dry. The wind had shifted, carrying a faint smell of smoke. Not from gunfire this time, but from something burning far away. "They set fire to the brush," he said quietly. "They're trying to smoke us out." Her eyes widened. "Then where can we go?" He looked toward the cliffs above. Up, the climb was brutal. The rock face was steep and jagged, the kind that tore at her palms and sent pebbles tumbling into the river below. The warrior climbed first, finding footholds with the ease of someone who knew the land like his own heartbeat. He paused often, reaching down to guide her up. Her muscles burned, but she refused to stop. She could hear the voices below again, faint but growing, the hunters following their trail. By the time they reached the ledge, the horizon had begun to pale. The first light of dawn painted the canyon in ghostly gold. From above, she could see the riders spreading out along the riverbank like black ants. There were more now, soldiers in uniform, not just bounty men. She counted at least a dozen. The warrior crouched beside her, scanning the valley. "They've called for the army," he said under his breath. "The law wants to end this quick." She shook her head. "And what?" "We didn't do anything." His jaw tightened. "You ran away with me. To them, that's enough." The cold wind tugged at her hair as she stared down at the riders. "You could leave me," she said quietly. "If you go now, you could still escape. They don't want you dead. They want me back." He turned toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. "You think I'd leave you to them? I don't want you to die because of me." A long silence passed between them. Then he said, "You don't understand, do you? They made me a husband, not by choice but by law. But I decided to stay because now it's not about law anymore." His words sank deep into her chest, heavier than the silence that followed. She looked at him, at the scars across his shoulders, the steady strength in his eyes. The realization that he would rather face death than give her up filled her with a strange ache, part fear, part something she didn't want to name. Below, the soldiers began lighting more fires, the smoke curling up the canyon walls. "They'll choke us out," he said. We moved north. They started walking along the ridge, keeping low. The land above the canyon stretched wide, miles of open scrub and dry wind. Somewhere beyond the northern ridge lay the reservation border, where even the army hesitated to follow. But reaching it meant crossing a plain with no cover. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, and the heat shimmered like glass. The woman's feet were blistered, her lips cracked, but she didn't complain. They walked in silence until the sound of distant gunfire broke the air again. Not behind them this time, but ahead. The warrior stopped, crouching low. A faint trail of smoke rose beyond a cluster of rocks. He motioned for her to stay back and crept forward. When he returned, his face was grim. "Scouts," he said. "They've circled us." She felt her stomach drop. "So there's no way through?" "Maybe one," he said. "But it's risky." He pointed toward a narrow gorge that cut through the ridge. "There's an old mine shaft there. My father used it once to escape the cavalry. It's deep and it'll take us underground. But if they find the entrance before we reach the end..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. They reached the mine as the sun dipped low. The entrance was half collapsed, hidden by brush. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old timber. Their footsteps echoed softly as they descended. The deeper they went, the darker it grew until they could only see by the faint glow of the flame he carried in his hand. The tunnel twisted through the earth like a scar, splitting into smaller paths. "Stay close," he whispered, "and no matter what you hear, don't stop." She nodded, gripping the back of his shirt as they moved deeper. The air was colder here, and she could hear water dripping somewhere ahead. Every sound seemed louder: the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through cracks, the distant rumble of thunder outside. Then came another sound, faint at first, but growing clearer. Voices. From behind. "They found the entrance," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "How far does this go?" "Far enough if we're lucky." The footsteps behind them grew louder. He grabbed her hand and began to run. The tunnel curved sharply, then widened into a large chamber supported by rotting beams. A shaft of light broke through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating a ladder that led upward. "Go," he said, handing her the small flame. "Climb, don't stop." "What about you?" "I'll hold them. No!" Her voice trembled. "You can't go," he said again, his tone firm, but not unkind. She hesitated only a second before turning to climb. Her hands shook as she gripped the rungs, her heart pounding in her ears. Below, she heard the echo of boots, then gunfire. Sparks flew as bullets struck the stone. The warrior fired back once, twice, before shouting something in his native tongue, a cry that carried through the tunnel like thunder. She reached the top and pushed against the loose boards that sealed the exit. Light spilled in, golden and blinding. She dragged herself out into the open air, gasping. Behind her, the sound of the battle below grew louder. She looked back at the hole, her breath uneven. "Please," she whispered, "please make it." Then she saw movement. Soldiers spreading out across the plain, closing in from both sides. The dust rose around them like smoke. The land had nowhere left to hide. She turned toward the tunnel, torn between running and staying, fear and defiance fighting in her chest. And then, from below, she heard his voice, shouting her name for the first time. She froze, staring down into the darkness, the echo of his call mixing with the rumble of thunder rolling across the open sky. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of something she couldn't yet see, the moment before everything broke. The sound of his voice rose again from below, echoing through the shaft, sharp and urgent against the rumble of thunder. The woman dropped to her knees beside the opening, her hands trembling as she called down his name. The echo swallowed her words, leaving only the hiss of wind and the faint ringing of gunfire that carried up from the dark. Dust billowed out of the tunnel mouth and her heart twisted at the thought that he might never climb out. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. All she could do was wait. Wait and pray the earth would release him back to her. A shadow appeared in the broken light. For a moment she thought it was one of the soldiers. Then she saw him, blood on his sleeve, his face drawn with exhaustion but alive. He climbed up, grabbing the edge with one arm. She reached out and pulled him with all the strength she had. He collapsed beside her, breathing hard, his hand gripping the ground as if he'd wrestled with the mountain itself. "You're hurt," she whispered. Seeing the dark stain spreading across his arm, he shook his head. "Just a scratch." But his breathing told her it was more than that. She tore a strip from her dress and wrapped it tight around his wound. His gaze met hers, soft but steady. "You should go," he said quietly. "They'll be here soon." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice firm even through the fear. He managed a faint smile. "You've learned stubbornness fast." The wind whipped around them, carrying the smell of rain. Lightning split the horizon, and the first drops began to fall, washing the dust from their faces. Far off, the soldiers' shouts grew louder as they spread across the open ground. She looked around and spotted a cluster of rocks not far from where the mine shaft opened. "There," she said. "We can hide." They stumbled toward the shelter, the rain falling harder now, drumming against the earth like a warning. Inside the rocks, they crouched close, the storm swallowing the sounds of pursuit. The world had turned to gray and thunder, and in that chaos, they found a strange kind of peace. Not safety, but a pause between two storms. After a while, the gunfire stopped. The wind shifted, and through the rain she could hear faint voices retreating. The soldiers were giving up the search, their torches dying one by one against the storm. The Apache warrior leaned his head back against the rock, closing his eyes. "The rain saved us," he said softly. She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "It saved you," she whispered. He opened his eyes and looked at her, the flicker of lightning reflecting in the dark depths of his gaze. "Maybe it saved both of us." They stayed there until the storm passed and the land fell quiet again. When the morning sun rose, the world looked washed clean, the sky bright and wide, the earth steaming with new life. She helped him stand, and together they made their way down the far side of the ridge. The horizon stretched endless before them, wild and empty. It didn't feel like running anymore. It felt like beginning. By midday they reached a valley where the grass grew tall and the river ran clear. Birds darted between the trees, and for the first time in days she heard laughter. Children's laughter. A small group of Apache families had made camp there, survivors from the burned settlement. When they saw the warrior, they rushed forward, calling his name with relief. The old chief was among them, leaning on his staff, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "You live," the chief said, his voice rough but warm. "Barely," the warrior answered with a faint smile. The old man's gaze shifted to the woman beside him. "And she stayed?" The warrior nodded. "She stayed." The chief studied her for a long moment, then motioned toward the fire. "Then she belongs here now, not as a prisoner, not as a bride forced by law, but as one who chose her path." The woman felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. She looked at the people gathered around, the faces marked by loss but softened by hope, and she realized she didn't feel like an outsider anymore. The fear that had once ruled her had turned into something deeper, something that anchored her to this land. Days passed as they rebuilt. The warrior's wound healed slowly, but he grew stronger with each sunrise. He worked beside the others, raising new shelters, tending the fire, teaching the children how to listen to the earth the way his father had taught him. She learned, too, how to grind corn, how to gather herbs from the hillside, how to move quietly through the forest trails. Each evening, as the sun dipped low, they sat together by the river, saying little but understanding everything that words could not carry. Sometimes, she thought of the town she had left behind, the wooden chapel, the cold stairs, the whispers that branded her as property. Those memories no longer hurt as they once did. They were just pieces of another life, one she no longer wished to return to. Here, under the endless western sky, she had found something worth keeping. Not just survival, but meaning. One night, when the air was cool and the stars burned bright, the warrior sat beside her by the fire. "The chief asked if I still claim you as wife," he said quietly. Her heart thudded. "And what did you say?" He smiled faintly. "I told him it doesn't matter what I claim. It's what you choose." The flames danced between them, and for a long time neither spoke. Then she reached across the fire, her hand brushing his. "Then I choose," she said softly. "Not because I was given, but because I want to stay." His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm. "Then I am the lucky one," he whispered. In the days that followed, the valley bloomed. New crops took root in the soil. The children laughed again, and the scars of the burned camp slowly faded. Travelers passing through the mountains sometimes spoke of an Apache camp hidden by the river, where a woman with fair hair lived among them, where peace had somehow taken hold in a land that had forgotten it. Most thought it was just a story, another legend born of the wild frontier. But those who saw it knew better. Years later, when the borders between tribes and towns had blurred and the wars of the desert had quieted, the same woman would be seen riding through the markets of a small village, her shawl woven in tribal colors, her eyes calm as the river that had once carried her to safety. Beside her, always, was the quiet Apache warrior, the man who had once whispered not to fear him, and who had kept that promise through every storm that followed. Their home stood near the riverbank, built from timber and stone, simple and strong. Every morning, she would rise to the sound of the water and the cry of hawks overhead. The world beyond their valley still held its dangers, soldiers, strangers, the weight of history. But here, in this small corner of the frontier, life was their own. Sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, she would look at him as he sharpened his knife or tended the fire, and think about the night they met. The trembling girl chosen by a lottery, and the quiet man who had every reason to walk away. She had been afraid then, but that fear had led her to something truer than any promise made in a chapel. The wind would rise over the plains, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke, and she would whisper the words that had changed everything. "I don't want to scare you," he had said once. And now, years later, she would smile and whisper back, "You never did." The world around them was still wild, still uncertain. But they had learned that peace was not the absence of danger. It was the courage to live through it together. Their story was whispered by campfires and carried by the wind, told as a tale of survival, love, and defiance, a reminder that even in a land built on broken promises, two souls could still choose each other and build something unbreakable. And when the sun finally set beyond the far hills, the valley fell quiet once more, the river glimmering under the last light. The land had seen too much pain to remember all the names lost to it, but it remembered theirs, the bride who stayed, and the Apache who taught her that freedom wasn't something you waited for. It was something you chose, even when the whole world said you couldn't.